All right, welcome. So I'm really excited today to talk about a subject that I don't get to share as often about as I wish I could, which of course is the subject of fortified wines. Um, some of the world's most intensely process-driven wines. Let's go ahead and share this for you here. So some of the world's most intensely process-driven wines, right? And what do we mean by process-driven wine? Well, process-driven wines are the idea that it is a process beyond just vinification. So we can certainly call all wines in some way processed wine because there is a process of making sure that the grape juice turns to wine and not vinegar. But in the case of these fortified style wines, there's more steps. There's a further process in terms of the fortification of the wine, and then typically in terms of how we age the wine that develop the characters of the wine itself. We're going to talk primarily about the three most common and classic styles of fortified wine today, along with some others, but really focusing on port, sherry, and Madeira. Now, while these three wines are all grouped together in the singular category of fortified wines, they really are three independent and indistinct styles. I think it's for those of us who might be studying for exam through the Quartermaster Sommeliers, ASA, WSCT, Master of Wine, Master Sommelier, so forth. It really helped to taste these wines side by side, and you really have the opportunity to see how distinct they can be, even within a single category, like sherry, for example. So because I love fortified wines, I have 5 fortified wines poured to my left here. 3 of them are sherries, which I really love. So I think it's kind of maybe we'll take a look at those in a few moments when we really go to talk about sherry. But if you're not so familiar with fortified wines right in the first place, look at how different these 3 colors are. These are all the same grape variety. It's a white grape called Palomino. So the process of how these wines were made post the fortification, the addition of alcohol, is really the determining factor in what drives the style of these 3 wines. So it's just really intensely fascinating how each of these different countries and wine regions developed these styles based on the grapes that they had, the needs, and where were the wines going, right? Like, why did fortified wines start to be made? So today we'll talk about that process and how that process affects sweetness. Some fortified wines are sweet, some are dry, some are off dry, and some are lusciously sweet. The process of fortification itself does not tell us if the wine will be dry or sweet. It's actually during the process of the fermentation of the initial grape juice that the fortification contribute to the sweetness of the wine. We'll talk about the major regions of fortified wine production. So Jerez or sherry, port, Madeira, Banyuls. We'll talk about a category known as Muscat Beaumes-de-Venise, Vin du Natural. We'll talk about mistels, which are, it's actually not fortified wine, but fortified grape juice. This is the process of fortifying the grape must before the fermentation. And we'll talk about Australia's famous Stickies today as well. Here you have a beautiful photo of the Douro Valley in Portugal. So you can really see these intensely steep terraces where the grapes are being grown above the Douro River. So what is a fortified wine? As I mentioned before, more than only the process of turning grape juice into wine. And the characteristics of fortified wine over centuries, I mean, centuries plural, right? We're going to be talking about as far back as the 1300s today. So over centuries plural, these wine regions that are primarily and mostly protected by the name of the appellation, right? Sherry, port, Madeira. These are all appellation names that protect the region of origin, the grapes grown, and that cannot be used by other wines in Europe and around the world. We'll get a little bit more into that because some places do still use these protected terms. So we'll talk about why that could be. But it carries the characteristics that come from the grape varieties and also the terroir, but also from the distinct production methods, right? We just looked at 3 different Palomino grapes, all in different colors. It is a process-driven wine, so it's how we treat the wine making and how long the wine ages for that really determines the style. The addition of alcohol is really the only thing that all of these wines have in common, with that we have fortified the wines as a means of typically stabilization, adding alcohol to the wine, especially in centuries past when we didn't have the same sort of adequate shipping and storage conditions and containers and quick times for shipping. I mean, imagine telling this guy here in this photo, right, that we would have Amazon 1-day delivery or like, Uber Eats. Like imagine Uber Eat your fortified wine. We may have never come up with a style of protecting the wine for shipping. So we add alcohol as a means to stabilize and fortify the wine. I would say that, like, fortify it, right? We're making it stronger so that it could survive longer bouts of shipping, primarily going to other countries across the sea. The stabilization gave us more opportunities for experimentation. It kept the wine sound for a longer period of time. And the first fortification was introduced in the mid-13th century by a doctor, Arnaud de Villeneuve, coming from the Languedoc region of France, Roussillon. He introduced the concept of moutage. So moutage is the French term for fortification. It means to mute the must. What does that mean, mute the must? That means to actually stop the process of the fermentation, and stopping the process of the fermentation with the addition of alcohol not only raises the finished alcohol of the wine that we're drinking, but also determines how much sugar is going to be left in the wine itself. And how do we do that? So how are fortified wines made? So first off, the juice is fermented, and it's important to understand the concept that all fortified wines are wines. You might notice here, and I think if you do live in New York City, it's pretty common if you go out somewhere and you get a sherry or a port or a Madeira or one of these fortified styled wines, like mostly today, even if you go another process-driven wine in the world, champagne, I think when I go out to most places in New York City these days, and especially at Corkbed, it's served in a regular wine glass. And that's really to illustrate the point that these are wines. They may be made in a different or specific style, but they are wines. They are coming from fermented grapes. So we begin the fermentation of the grape juice after we've harvested the grapes for all of these regions, like a normal wine fermentation. So the same way we would drink a Chardonnay, a Pinot Noir, a Cabernet, a Syrah, right? There are certain steps during the fermentation that we add the alcohol to fortify the wine. And adding the alcohol will immediately stop the fermentation if that level of alcohol is high enough. So each one of these regions we'll talk about has a minimum level of grape spirit that we add to the fermenting juice to halt that fermentation. And so one thing we didn't mention too is, like, what are they using? When I say fortify, add alcohol, are we adding, grain spirits? Are we adding bourbon? Is it corn? In the process of all fortified wines, it is brandy. So brandy is essentially a distilled wine. You take a wine and you distill it the same way to make, whiskey. You take almost like a beer or a wort and you distill that. So brandy is what we use for the fortification. So it's a distilled beverage made from grapes. We might be familiar with brandy, especially in areas like Cognac or Armagnac, where it's has a much deeper color to it, right? It might be kind of like almost kind of like golden colored, like my Amontillado, or like a little bit straw colored, like my Fino here for brandy or for Cognac or Armagnac. And that's because those regions do require that we age the resulting spirit in oak barrels. So it gains some of that color through the barrel and also through oxidation, which is where it gets those barrel flavors, right? The clove and nutmeg, vanilla, butterscotch, and spice characteristics. Now, when we're using this brandy for the fortification of wines, it's not usually aged in oak. So essentially, if anybody's ever tried like a white dog whiskey, which is essentially, you know, whiskey or bourbon made from corn and other grains, and distilled, but then not aged in oak, that's essentially what we have with this brandy. So it's not aged in oak. It is a very neutral, kind of fiery, young grape spirit. And the addition of that high alcohol beverage to the fermenting juice essentially kills off the yeast. So the yeast is no longer there to consume any of the sugar that's in the wine. So this is what we talk about with the fortification. So when we add a neutral grape spirit during the fermentation, stopping the fermentation by killing the yeast, we have a fortified wine with residual sugar. So this is a vin du natural. When we add a neutral grape spirit after the fermentation is completed, we have a dry fortified wine. So during the fermentation, a vin du natural would be something like a port, where the wine ferments for usually around 2 to 3 days, gaining some color and complexity from the skins of the red grape. And then it's fortified. And so it kills off that yeast and leaves a lot of the natural residual sugar in the wine, and now with a higher alcohol level, right? So something like port is higher alcohol with sugar in it too. It's sweet and fiery. If we have something like sherry, where the initial wine is fermented to complete dryness, like a regular still table wine, and then we fortify it, we have a dry wine with a higher level of alcohol from the fortification. If we add our neutral grape spirit, our brandy, to the fresh grape must prior to the fermentation, we have a mistel or a vin de liqueur, which we'll talk about. We mentioned that in the first slide when we saw our picture with the vineyard in the Douro in Porto, right? We saw that was one of the things that we mentioned we talked about today, the concept of a mistel, fortified prior to the fermentation. So mistel can be really interesting because the flavor is a little bit different than what we find for styles of fortified wine, right? Fortified wine that are fortified after the fermentation has already started. So the final beverage always has a higher alcohol by volume. This alcohol by volume is really one of the things that allows these wines to age, and especially to be able to go through the processes that we'll see that develop the character of each one of these wines. Please also don't hesitate to ask me if you have any questions. If anybody else is jumping on and you missed anything, I have my camera turned off so I can focus on the screen. So I may not see you if you are making any gestures, but feel free to unmute yourself or ask questions through the chat box. If you're drinking fortified wine, what are you drinking? I'm curious. So let's just dive right into the region of port. So Douro, DOP, and Porto, DOP, share the same boundaries that you can see on the right-hand map on the screen. Douro DOP is for the still dry table wines based on the grape varieties that we also use for port. And the Porto DOP is specifically for the fortified wine. So if you see, even though you know that port is made in the Douro Valley, if you see Douro on the label, this is not a fortified wine. It is a regular, dry, still wine that does not have the addition to alcohol, but made from the same grapes. Port's a really interesting place. It's a continental climate. It has very, very hot summers, very cold winters. Its proximity to the river to make your way out to the port, to the towns of Porto and Villanova de Gaia, really gave this region a lot of advantage over other kind of wine producing or other fortified wine producing regions. This was a place that was really the history of port and how it rose in England was really advantageous due to its time. It was in the kind of late 1600s, 1678, that an Englishman was traveling in this area. He went to an abbey and he realized that there was a monk or an abbot at this abbey that was producing wine that he was fortifying. So in the late 1670s, 1678, fortifying these wines. He really enjoyed the wine and he decided to ship some of these wines back to England. They shipped well, even during this time. The trip from Portugal to England, especially from this inland region of Porto, you can see kind of up here, right? So this here Portugal, and here is the Douro Valley that we're looking at here. So we're a little bit further inland. You'd have to travel downriver to the coast and then up the coast of the Atlantic to England, right? So even this would take quite some time. But because the wines were fortified and they were stronger, they traveled and they upheld the journey very well. And when they got to England, they became quite popular. It was sort of a new style of wine for a lot of English wine drinkers. They called it blackstrap. It was firmer and fiery and more bold. And it really was congruent also with the start of a lot of war, tension, and embargo between England and France. Where did England get a lot of its wine during this period? I mean, the English were and still are Francophiles, right? But Portugal and Port really stepped in to fill the gap that was left by these embargoes on France. So although these embargoes were lifted and reinstated over decades, Portugal was really there to fill that void. And Port became a very, very popular product for England during this time. So how do we make port? So we pick our grapes. There are a lot of rules that go into the grapes for port. There's a system known as the beneficio, and it decides how each of these vineyards are rated based on, I mean, and look at how crazy these vineyards are, right? So based on aspect, based on grape variety, based on where you face the sun, based on your soil types. And essentially each one of these vineyards are rated. So you hope to be in one of the best vineyards or have grapes in one of the best vineyards. You harvest your grapes, they're crushed, and they undergo, as I mentioned, a very short fermentation. So in port, usually our fermentation is only about 2 to 3 days. So we're really looking for an extraction of color. So we're in a hot region, right? We're getting a really hot, furious fermentation that's extracting a lot of color from the skins of the grape during this time. It's kind of violent. But however, once we have the desired level of sugar in the wine, essentially the sugar going down in the juice, right? Because the yeast is consuming the sugar and fermenting it into alcohol. But once we still have the desired level of sweetness left in the wine for the style of port being made, the wine is then fortified. So we have this sugar that's left in the wine due to stopping the yeast from doing its job. And if there's anybody that's like, hey, I don't get what you're saying, or like, can you explain that more, or we already know all of these things, you can tell me that too. So the beneficio, once we've selected the grapes from the best vineyards rated A through F, fortified with the aguardente, it's a grape spirit. The aguardente in Portugal used for port production has to be at 77% alcohol. So that's what the ABV of the distilled brandy is at. And this boosts the alcohol of the port wine to around 19 to 22%. Port is then aged and shipped in barrels known as pipes. Three different sizes, a different size for aging in Porto, a different size for aging in Villanova de Gaia, and a different size for shipping. But essentially prior to the mid 1980s, all of the wines after they were made in the Douro region would be shipped downriver, and they would be aged on the coast in these two towns, Porto and Villanova de Gaia. Once we had more of the advent of cooler facilities to age wine, it was just a little bit too hot in the Douro Valley to age wine. But once we had the advent of cooler facilities, that stopped being a law that they had to be aged on the coast. So some might still be, but most are now aged at the property prior to release. The main grape that we see, most port wines are red. Touriga Nacional is considered to be the highest quality of the grape, followed by Touriga Francesca, Tinto Roriz, which is also Tempranillo, Tinta Cao, and Tinta Barroca. You might see some white port. I forgot that I actually put some white port in the fridge. I forgot to grab it out. I already have 5 glasses of port, 5 glasses of fortified wine poured here. But a really popular Portuguese drink, especially in the summer, is white port and tonic. It's not quite as sweet as the red style of port. It's meant to be consumed young and fresh, and it's just kind of a light, almost like spritz style. Now, when it comes to stylistically, how we understand the style of the port. And also we'll say this with sherry too when we get there, that there are two really broad overarching styles. Those styles are ruby and tawny. Ruby ports, so you can see these two wines come from the same essential blend of grape varieties. So each port house will essentially decide which grapes they're using in the blend, depending on the style of wine that they want to make. But both of these are made from that same selection of 5 grapes that we mentioned, right? So on the left-hand side, this is an example that you can just see here of a ruby port. Now, this has a much more opaque, intense, dense ruby color because it's a bottle-aged style of port. It's been very little time in barrel before it's bottled, and that lesser time spent in barrel and with oxygen gives us a more red-fruited, berry-scented, fiery, and deeper opaque, more ruby-colored wine. On the right-hand side, tawny styles are aged in wood or oak barrels for a much longer period of time. This barrel aging allows for a lot more exchange of oxygen and also more of the color to kind of drop out of suspension in the wine. So in wine, if you ever see like sediment in the bottom of your bottle, that's actually the color that's dropping out over time. This is why older red wines tend to have more sediment in them than younger red wine. So when you're aging your wine in barrel for an extended period of time, some of that color is already dropping out of suspension into the bottom of the barrel, and the wine is bottled off of that sediment, right? So in a ruby port, you have more chances, obviously, to have sediment in the bottle. In a tawny port, you'll really very rarely ever need to decant a bottle of tawny port. You don't need to be worried typically about sediment in the bottom of the bottle like you do with a ruby style of port. So under the ruby category, you see ruby, which is the kind of more, I would say, most entry level, most bulk style. It's aged for about 2 to 3 years before bottling, usually in something like stainless steel. It could be wood, concrete. It's sold to be drunk young and fresh. These are kind of your inexpensive styles of port. They will have a more fiery, high alcohol, sort of berry character to them. The best style of port is considered to be a vintage port. So vintage ports are only produced in the very best years. Not every producer has to bottle what's called a vintage port in one of these good years. Each producer or house can choose kind of based on where they are within the region, right? Or how their vineyard themselves fared during this year. But producers choose whether to declare a vintage port for their house or not. Generally, we would see only about 3 vintages declared from any one producer in about a decade. And so they tend to be the best years. These come from the best selection of grapes and vineyards. They're aged in cask for 3 years prior to bottling, and they develop in the bottle for decades. Because, I mean, so I was just looking up, before class, reviewing kind of my port vintages, and I was looking at a list of port vintages back to 1896, which the 1896 is still considered to be a terrific vintage, still drinkable. And then up to 2006, anything between like the 1990s and 2006, you can drink now, like it's ready to start drinking, but you could still hold it in your cellar in the right condition. Anything from 2007 until now is recommended to hold. Don't even touch that vintage port yet. It's not ready. It needs to continue to develop. You should always decant a vintage port because there will be a lot of sediment in the bottom of the bottle. That sediment won't hurt you if you consume it. It's just not that pleasant on the palate. There are some wine lovers out there that say that they love to drink sediment though. So maybe that's for you. Now, these two terms, single quinta vintage and late bottled vintage, can be a little confusing because they do see vintage, but you can just remember it like this. If it says vintage only, that's the best style, vintage port. Single quinta vintage, this is usually will be the backbone of what would be a vintage port in a declared year. But in a single quinta vintage, this is usually a good vintage. And it's the bottling of a single estate fruit. It can list a vintage date on the bottle. And then you'll see a late bottled vintage. This is also done in a good vintage, and the wines are aged in cask a bit longer than you see for vintage port, 4 to 6 years, and they'll last, depending on the vintage and the producer, they'll last probably 10 to 20 years, really, that you can drink them. We see some LVVs right now. I think we have 2016 on our list at Cork Buzz. There will oftentimes be a bit of sediment in the bottom of a bottle for the late, the LVV, we also call them, LVV or late bottled vintage style ports. So on the right-hand side are tawny ports. Tawny styles aged in barrel, that oxidation and that longer aging in barrel depletes some of the color of the wine, right? So these are both coming from red grapes. Tawny, again, just like ruby, your most entry level style of wine. They tend to be paler, they have less aging, and most port lovers would say that just a tawny on its own is not really indicative of the very true tawny style. And I do have a tawny port here, and so you can see, if you can see my camera here, you can see this really beautiful, this is from red grapes, but it has this really, really beautiful color to it, right? You can kind of see here. Really beautiful tawny pale color. It's transparent. I can see through the wine. There's no sediment in it, even though, so this is a 10-year, tawny port, but it was bottled in 1974. This actually belongs to my partner, but I poured myself some for class tonight. So bottled in 1974, and even though it's been in the bottle that long, there is no sediment to the wine, right? Because it was aged. There might be in the very bottom. This is pretty full to the top, so there might be some sediment as we get a little bit further down. A reserve tawny is a blend of vintages and aged a minimum of 7 years in cask. A colheita tawny is also a vintage dated tawny port, aged a minimum of 7 years. Is a vintage dated, so reserve tawny, a blend of vintages, a minimum aging of 7 years. Colheita is a vintage dated, a minimum of 7 years. And then we have tawny port with an indication of age. So that was what I just showed you, tawny port with a 10-year indication of age. So these ports will be a blend of vintages. They are a oxidative from the longer period of cask aging, as you can see, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And essentially, these wines are submitted to a panel, as most European wines are, that list an appellation on the label. And you can say, I'm submitting my 10, my 20, my 30-year-old 30 or 40-year-old tawny port, and you're saying that this is a style that tastes like. So it doesn't have to be exactly 10 years old. It just has to be, because it will be a blend of vintages, right? It just has to have to be indicative and representative of the style of 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. Isn't port fun? All right, moving on to Madeira. I don't have a Madeira wine at home. I love Madeira wines. I actually drink quite a bit of sherry, but I think out of all of the fortified wines, I really love Madeira. It has a beautiful sweetness to it, but a really bright acidity that sometimes makes especially the drier styles of like Sochaux and Verdelho feel almost dry on the palate. But how is Madeira different? So both Madeira and port are wine regions that belong to Portugal. We know that the Douro Valley is located in northeastern Portugal, as we looked at earlier, but Madeira is located in the Atlantic Ocean. It's over 600 miles southwest of the mainland of Portugal. So it's an archipelago of islands. Just the island of Madeira and the island of Porto Santo are inhabited, and these are the two islands you can make wine on to call it Madeira. It's a very, very tropical, semi-tropical, mountainous region with a lot of vegetation. Madeira was discovered in the 1400s, and they said that they wanted to make the island, after they were claimed, more inhabitable, and they wanted to ready the soils in the island for more crops of grapes, bananas, sugarcane, all sorts of things that they grow there. And so they actually set the island on fire to burn down some of the really excessive vegetation that was there in the 1400s. 1600. And the story is that there was so much vegetation that the island burned for 7 years before they were able to use it for agriculture. So today we have 4 main noble grapes and then one other grapes that we see for kind of your entry-level styles of Madeira. So the 4 main styles are Sochal, Verdelho, Boal, and Malmsey. All 4 of these are white grapes. And then we have Tinta Negra, which is the red grape of Madeira style wines. Most of the vines are trained in the pergola system here. We are, as we mentioned, subtropical, so a lot of humidity in this area. You can see these tiny little terraces that you have just dotting the island of Madeira. There are 8 essentially there are 8 producers of Madeira on the island, but only 6 of them actively export wine, and most of them buy grapes from thousands of small growers on the island. So the majority of growers have less than half a hectare of their own vine for Madeira, and they're really polycultural. So they grow, as I mentioned before, like sugarcane, passion fruit, bananas, and things like that are also really big agricultural crops on the island as well. So the production companies will typically make and export the wine, but there are a lot of smaller brands like Rare Wine Company, Broadbent Selection would be a couple of examples that pay these companies to make, store, and age their wine and then sell it under their own labels. Now, Madeira has a range of sweetness levels. If it doesn't list one of these 4 noble grapes, now these will not be blended usually, Sochal, Verdelho, Boal, and Malmsey. The grapes are considered to be so prestigious in their own right. So usually you'll see them as single varietals. If you do not see a wine on a label of Madeira, it's usually Tinta Negra. It can be Tinta Negra blended with a small amount of some of these other grapes as well. Now, these 4 grapes on the island of Madeira are not only the names of the grapes, but also the names and the reference to the styles of Madeira made. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as port, right? Ruby and tawny for port, we get that. That makes a lot of sense. Bottle aged, ruby colored, barrel aged, tawny colored. So a little bit more memorization goes into Madeira. If you can remember the range of sweetness levels, you'll be in a good place. So the driest styles of Madeira are Sochal and Verdelho in that order. So Sochal is the driest, and Verdelho is a little bit sweeter. Sochal will usually be between, I think it's something like 18 and like 46 grams of residual sugar for Sochal, which is pretty dry, especially for a fortified style of wine, as we will see as we move into things like the Muscat Beaumes-de-Venise and the Stickies coming from Australia. Now, Sochal and Verdelho are fortified during the fermentation, much like port, but it's after the wines are almost nearly dry. So there's a little small amount of residual sugar left in the wine. Boal and Malmsey are the sweeter styles in that order, Boal and then Malmsey being the sweetest, are fortified much earlier on during the fermentation. They're only partially fermented, so they retain a lot more of that natural sugar in the wine. And what's really important about Madeira is that it goes through a process of Madeirization. Essentially, the wines of Madeira are cooked. The entry-level wines will typically be produced in what we call the estufagem system. Estufagem is meant to replicate the process that was created when Madeira wines were first being made by sending these casks of wine in the 15, the 16, the 1700s across the Atlantic Ocean to New World colonies. So in a lot of the kind of Spanish and Portuguese traders that were sailing and creating colonies within the New World, they had a few outposts that they would have to stop at before they would cross the ocean completely. So for Portugal, Madeira was really, the island was really that last place that the sailors could stop for fresh water, fresh food, coffee, sugar, wine, importantly, wine and things like that. And so they would often take these wines aging in cask, essentially, for the sailors and for the colonies within the New World. And they started noticing that the wine would be much better. They would fortify the wine to make them stronger for the journey. And they noticed that they would also be better once they got to the end of their journey, whether that was Brazil or the Americas, for example, and even better if they made the return trip in the ship. So the ship would be, the barrels would essentially be ballast in the bottom of the ship, and they would have this process of cooking and cooling, heating and cooling, heating and cooling, as they were crossing the ocean and crossing sometimes even the equator, right, into these kind of cooler and then warmer subtropical climates. So they started to recreate the process of sending the wine back and forth through the estufagem process, which is the more modern process where after the wines are fortified, the wine is put into stainless steel tanks. And these stainless steel tanks have these, they're called a stufa, have these sort of serpentine coils inside of the tank that sit inside of the wine, and they heat the wine. So around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And they really begin to sort of caramelize the sugars of these wines. So the estufagem wines are aged for a minimum of 3 months in these tanks. They're heated to this 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and they're kept at that heat for 3 months, a minimum of 3 months. They're aged, the wines are cooled, they're left in tank for about 90 days, and then they're aged in cask for a little bit longer. The minimum aging process required for a Madeira wine made in the estufagem process is 2 years. So it is a time-consuming process, not as long as sending a wine from Madeira to, Savannah, Georgia, or to Brazil and then back. But it is a faster process that crafts the wine. And then we also have the Cantairo method. So the Cantairo method is a much better style, or a much higher quality style of mimicking the wine being in the bottom of these ships. And the Cantairo method will typically be used for your Sochal, your Verdelho, your Boal, your Malmsey. More rainwater styles or Tinta Negra styles of Madeira are more likely to be made in the estufagem process. So in the Cantairo method, after you've fortified your wine, the wines go into cask, and then they're put into attics on the island of Madeira. Usually the wines are aged in like the capital, which is Funchal. And if you haven't been to Madeira, and I have not, but I just am desperate to go to this island. I mean, it's beautiful there. Just look at these pictures. If you are into the outdoors, if you are into hiking, if you're into food, and if you are into Madeira, this is the place to go. So in the capital city of Funchal, you have a lot of these attics. The cask with the wine are put into the attic. They're warm, they're hot, they're warmed by the sun, and the process of making wines in the Cantairo method are a minimum of 2 years. Just like many other wine producing regions in the world, when you have a minimum required aging, many producers will choose to age the wine for much longer to develop the character that they want. Colheita wines are single vintage Madeiras that have to be aged a minimum of 5 years in cask, and then Fresqueira are a single vintage Madeira that are aged a minimum of 20 years in cask before they are bottled. Because, the nemesis, we always say, like, what is the nemesis of wine, right? Whenever you bring a really nice bottle of wine home and you're like, gosh, I'm not going to drink it right away. Like, how should I keep it? We say this. I have I have a wine rack here on the side, away from light. That's why there's curtains here, because I have a window here and the sun comes streaming in the morning, which is lovely, but not for wine. So I have this little curtain over this wine rack. It's kept on its side. We have to keep it away from heat, and we have to keep it away from light, right? So those are really kind of an oxygen, but the cork in the bottle is what's keeping it away from oxygen. So heat, light, and oxygen are kind of the nemesis of wine. This is what makes it age prematurely, or what makes wine turn bad in the bottle. I mean, it will eventually turn bad if it doesn't have enough structure to age the wine. But these wines, Madeira is indestructible because it's already been exposed to oxygen. It's already been exposed to heat. I mean, it's in barrel, so it hasn't really been exposed to light. But, like, really these wines have been made indestructible because everything that ruins wine has already purposefully happened to them, but in the best way, in the best way. And you sometimes will get, you can get regular table wines like a red Burgundy, or like Pinot Noir from Russian River Valley, or Sauvignon Blanc from Sancerre. And if you have a a merchant who had been moving that wine, cross country during the summer and not keeping it in temperature controlled containers, you will have a style of Sancerre that could be Madeirized. But this isn't why we want to enjoy Sancerre, right? One, it's not fortified, and one, it's probably not a long, slow, continuous process of heating like we have here that really caramelizes the sugars that are left in the wine. But you might have a little bit of that kind of like nutty Madeirized character that you get from the wine too. Okay, we're doing well on time. Good. I don't want to keep everybody too late tonight. So Sherry, Jerez Sherry. So this is the traditional appellation name for the wine. So you see it on every bottle of sherry wine here, this little, Jerez Sherry DO. This is because it is such a historically consequential wine that was also so important and to the economy of many different countries, that the actual DO name, the denomination of origin in Spain, lists both the English, the French, and the Spanish name for sherry. One thing we didn't mention, and not to jump back and forth, but I mentioned over and over that Madeira was coming to America during the 1516, 1700s. Madeira was the wine that Americans drank. Like I've heard it said, there's kind of a theory that's been floated around that like Madeira is the most typical American wine that you could have, because this is what people were drinking. So in England, they were drinking port, and in America, they were drinking Madeira. And you had a lot of shippers that were coming and picking up Madeira and taking it to cities like New York, Savannah, Charleston are all really good examples, Boston, all of these port cities up and down the East Coast. And there is actually, I don't have them here, but there's a really great company called the Rare Wine Company. And they're one of these companies who has a producer on Madeira make wine for them, and they sell it under their own label. And they have a Madeira series called the Historical Series or Historic Series. And each one of their Madeira, their Sochaux, their Boumsy, their Mal, their Verdelho, are named for the port city in the US that most preferred that style. So the one named New York, the one named Charleston, all the cities I just mentioned, right? Charleston, Savannah, and Boston, which is pretty cool. It's a really fun, they're not the least expensive Madeiras. I haven't bought a bottle in a while, but I want to say the last time I bought one, they were probably each around like $55 or $60 retail for like a regular $750 50 milliliter wine bottle. But they're a really fun opportunity to try them side by side. And when you're making an investment like that into wine, remember, these wines will not go bad. There's nothing that you can do to them that will make them turn. So these are wines that you can open it and you can keep it open in your apartment for years. I actually have a wine here, a sherry, that I've had open for 4 or 5 years at home. Kind of an interesting story. So maybe I'll share that as we talk about sherry. So 3 main grapes, Palomino, Pedro Jimenez, and Muscatel. 95% of all wines in Jerez and all sherry wines are made from the single white grape of Palomino. Pedro Jimenez and Muscatel are also white grapes, but they're much lower proportions of plantings than we have for Palomino. So almost everything. There are 2 winds that really come through this region, the Poniente and the Levante. One is a cooler, more moisture-filled wind that comes from the Atlantic, and the other, the Levante, is a much warmer wind that comes from the eastern side of Spain. A drier, hotter, warmer wind. And this really helps encourage the production of something we call flor. So flor is essentially, it's a style of yeast. Just like we have yeast that are eating the sugar and consuming the sugar in the wine, which is how we turn grape juice into wine. The flor is a layer of yeast that grows on top of the wine as it's aging in the barrel in the Jerez or in the sherry region. Now, because this flor wine can grow, or this flor yeast can grow on top of the wine, we tend to see some different styles that are made because of this, right? So I have our 3 styles of sherry, all made from the white Palomino grapes here in my hand. So sherry wines are traditionally they're dry. There are sweet styles of sherry, Muscatel, the Pedro Jimenez or PX, and cream sherries are sweeter styles of sherry. But primarily, if you go to this region and you travel in Spain, most of what you are going to see are these dry styles. The base wine is fermented to dryness. So essentially you have a regular still dry wine. Palomino on its own is not a really interesting or flamboyant grape. It's fairly neutral on its own. It has moderate acidity. Because it has more of this neutrality, that's what makes it such a great wine and a great palate for these different styles of aging that we see that contribute to these different styles of sherry wine. So after the wine is fermented to dryness, we classify the wine, and the wines are classified based on the gentleness of the original wine. It's not quite the right word that I meant to use, but for some reason the other word's not coming. Kind of the gentleness of the wine, or the robustness of the wine, to either be a Manzanilla or a Fino style, or an Oloroso style. So once the wines have been classified for their either biological or oxidative style of wine, Fino or Oloroso, they're then fortified. The level of fortification varies based on the destined style. So a Fino or Manzanilla style wine will be fortified to about 15.5% alcohol, so not nearly as high as we see in something like Port or Madeira. And an Oloroso style will be fortified to usually between like 17 and 19% alcohol for an Oloroso. So you're like, well, what's the middle style you showed us? So yeah, so you can just see here we're this is kind of the area more or less that like Christopher Columbus left from to sail to the New World. There's three main towns of production: El Puerto de Santa Maria, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and Jerez de la Frontera. And these three different areas for aging, those three towns in the Sherry Triangle, they call it, really do contribute to how the wines age as well. So what are the different styles of sherry? So the easiest way to remember it, just like Port, Ruby, and Tawny, it's Fino and Oloroso. So if you can remember Fino and Oloroso, then you can remember the other styles of sherry that kind of stem from those main two styles. So Fino is your lightest and most delicate. That was the word I was looking for before, not gentle, delicate style. So usually fortified to 15 or 15% alcohol. These wines are always protected by flor. Now, this flor will consume any leftover, even though these wines are fermented to dryness, sometimes there's a very, very small amount of like imperceptible residual sugar left in wine. Flor will consume anything that's left because it is a yeast. So your Fino styles are your lightest, they're your driest, they're your most delicate. They tend to have flavors that are more like olive and brine and toast, brioche, manzanilla, chamomile flower tend to be the most common, maybe like Marcona olive, your most common sort of descriptors for Fino styles of sherry. They tend to be aged, all sherry have to be aged the minimum of 2 years. So the minimum, this has actually been lessened from 3 years about a decade or so ago. But they're all aged the minimum of 2 years, some based on producer preference, aged much longer, of course. Lustau makes a style of sherry, or Valdespino makes a style of Fino sherry that ages for 12 years before they release it, right? So these are really crazy too, because for how labor intensive these wines are, they're really inexpensive for how much goes into making these wines, and the fact that after the wines are made, winemakers age them for years and years and years on the property. I once had a Madeira from 1912 of Verdelho. It was $250. It's a lot of money. I didn't buy it. Somebody bought it for me. It's $250 for 3 ounces. But 1912, like imagine, and it was one of the most unique, it was for a birthday, and it was one of the most unique things I've ever tasted. And it really elevated that occasion because, it's, you have a birthday where you're just drinking something that you probably, you'll never taste again, and you would probably assume you would have never tasted in your life. And it was stunning. It was a stunning style of wine. So, these wines really have a lot of ageability to them. And the fact that they are aged so long at the property, and then they sell for that cheaply is pretty crazy, right? All right, so Amontillado, actually we're going to skip Amontillado. So Fino is the lightest, most delicate style. There's another category of Fino called Manzanilla. Manzanilla is even lighter than Fino. It is exactly the same in every way as the Fino style sherry in terms of how it's made, how the floor grows on top of this wine. They call it biological aging, meaning it's not exposed to oxygen, except Manzanilla sherries are aged in the seaside town of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and they have a thicker layer of floor that contribute to more of, again, that kind of like briny, more olivey, salty, brioche character to the wine. Oloroso is your other category. Fino, which an offshoot is Manzanilla. Oloroso is oxidatively aged. It never ages under that layer of floor that you see here. So biological aging under floor, oxidative aging, no floor, exposed to oxygen in its entirety during the process of making the wine. So what this means is that you don't have that yeast to eat away at any leftover sugars, and there are no sugars in this wine. I mentioned before, sometimes there's like 1 or 2 or less grams, or sometimes even like negative 1.5 grams of residual sugar left in a wine after the initial fermentation. But what floor really does in the Fino style is that it really eats away at anything that would be almost perceived as sugar. So Oloroso is dry, but it has a richer, more vinous texture to the palate of the wine, not because there's actually sugar, but because there's a little bit of like almost like glycol. Like it's not sweet, there's no sugar to it, but it has that kind of richer texture, more vinous texture to the wine. Olorosos are fortified to a higher level of alcohol because what kills yeast? Alcohols. So Oloroso wines, because they're aged oxidatively, are fortified to a higher level of alcohol so that floor will not grow on these wines. The oxidative nature of aging the wine for a minimum of 2 years with oxygen exposure. And that oxygen exposure means that the barrels are never, oops, so go back here. The barrels are not filled all the way. So in this case, you can see a sherry butt, what they call the barrel. It's only filled about 2/3 of the way full or 3/4 of the way full, so that either it can have floor growing on the top, or if there was no floor, the wine would be oxidizing. So when wine oxidizes, it takes on more kind of nutty caramel, candied nut, candied orange peel, Turkish delight sometimes in a way, like candied walnuts, almost a kind of like a maple syrup or a toffee flavor. So the wine smells sweet, like it smells a little bit like breakfast, but when you taste the wine, it's dry. I actually really love Oloroso. I've had it with like scrambled eggs and uni before, and it's a really, really great pairing. Now you might be like, so what is Amontillado? So Amontillado and Palo Cortado stem from both a Fino and an Oloroso. So an Amontillado and a Palo Cortado start their lives as a Fino sherry, meaning they age under floor, but then for some reason, sometimes that's a stylistic choice by the winemaker, but sometimes the floor doesn't survive. Sometimes that layer of floor or yeast will die off on its own, and the winemaker makes the choice to reclassify the wine. So they'll reclassify the wine as either an Amontillado or a Palo Cortado, where they spend the first part of their life as a Fino and the second part of their life as an Oloroso. So because of that, they have some of the characteristics of both. Initially, they were fortified to just 15 to 15.5%. Once they've reclassified the wine, they fortify it additionally to raise the alcohol to around 17 to 19% traditionally. So you can see just in the wine, so on my left, as you're looking like this one, that's the Fino, right? Pretty light, pretty straw colored. Here we have the Amontillado. So started as a Fino, ended as an Oloroso. And then here we have the Oloroso, and you can just see the difference in the color and the oxidation. Because it is both a Fino and an Oloroso, Amontillado or Palo Cortado will still have a little bit of that delicate nature. They'll be a little bit more salty in their character, slightly nutty, but then they'll also have a bit of that caramel to it. Oh, this is a great question. So, Lauren, thank you. So I really love, traditionally, I prefer the Amontillados and the Palo Cortados, because I like a little bit of that freshness that they get from the Fino style. But lately I've really been into Oloroso. You know, just like your palate changes, or not that it changes, but sometimes you're just more interested in one style over another. And I really like having sherry around. So I'll send it out in the follow-up note tomorrow, but I'm also a member of a sherry club, which is why I have 3 sherries here. And I have 6 bottles shipped to me every 6 months. My partner and I share them and we drink them with friends. But because they're fortified and they last much longer after you've opened them, like I really like coming home, and if I want to have something to drink, but I don't want to make a cocktail, or I don't have the right ingredients, and I don't want to open a bottle of wine, like having, 2 or 3 ounces of sherry is like almost perfect. And you don't have to worry about, if you open a bottle, you don't have to worry about finishing it before it goes bad. So all of these above were naturally dry. If they are sweetened with the addition of either Pedro Jimenez or Moscatel, they will become a cream sherry. So they'll have a pale cream, medium cream, cream sherry, the reference to the different styles of sweetness. I don't think we see a lot of cream sherry. Like it's kind of, I mean, I have this bottle here of cream sherry. It's a little bit more of it's a style that was really created for the British market by British shippers. This is a really interesting bottle that I haven't really been able to find out where it came from. My partner bought this bottle at Chambers Street Wine. They bought it from a private collection and we weren't able to find out any more information, but it says on the bottom here, I mean, first off, look at the shape of this bottle. So this is before, like modern glass making. All bottles were different shapes, right? They all looked a little bit differently. So you can already tell, you're like, is this bottle, is it just made to look like that? Or is this really that old of a bottle? But it says on the bottom that this is the 100th anniversary bottling, or the bottling celebrating the 100th anniversary of this estate. And the estate was founded in 1768. So I don't know if that means that like genuinely this was bottled in 1868. Because we have not been able to find out, but it really, I mean, it's not bad. It's still good. I would say sherry is not as indestructible as Madeira. It tastes a little, it does have sweetness to it. It does taste like sherry. It has a little bit of this really interesting kind of like vegetal quality to it. I don't want to say like quite moldy. I mean, you can tell I've had it for like 5 years. There's still a little bit in here. Every now and then we retaste it. We're like, what is this happening with this? But we genuinely don't know if this was, and it's still good. It smells good when I smell it. Yeah, it smells good. Maybe I'll try a little bit later, but it could be from 1868, or it could have just been, kind of like a 1960s instead of the 1860s, Art Deco throwback to that era. Like we really have no idea. I mean, it says on the bottom, bottled for the 100th anniversary. And it was established in 1768, but who knows? Could be a testament to the power, the staying power of fortified wines. Okay, so just a couple more slides to get through. We'll talk about Banyuls, and then we'll move on to Muscat-based wines. Banyuls is the southernmost appellation in mainland continental France. It shares boundaries with the region of Coulior. So much like we talked about the Douro DOP and the Porto DOP, Banyuls and Coulior. Banyuls is for fortified wine. Coulior is for still regular table wines. Banyuls for fortified only, but they share the same boundaries. This is the birthplace of Vin du Natural in the 13th century in the area of Rousseau, from our doctor that we mentioned before. 90% of all French fortified wines come from Roussillon. They come from this area. So the warmer southern area is really popular for the style. A lot of strong winds in this Mediterranean climate. There's very low yield. Banyuls is primarily based on Grenache Noir. I do have a Banyuls here too. So primarily based on Grenache, Grenache Noir, or the red Grenache grape. It needs to account for a minimum of 50% of the blend. If you have Banyuls Grand Cru, the minimum is 75% Grenache, which is what I have here, with a minimum of 30 months of aging in the barrel. This is the Grand Cru 2010. Because it is coming from Grenache, I mean, it is sort of tawny because it is older. It's aged a minimum of 30 months in the barrel. I'm sure this one was aged much longer.
Amber, what does the Banyuls taste like?
The Banyuls?
Yeah.
So it has like, it is definitely, and I wish I put it on here, what the level of fortification is, but it's much higher than not the sweetest styles of Madeira, but much higher than like Social, obviously much higher than Sherry. It has a red fruit character to it, so it has this kind of almost like strawberry jam, but then you also have that kind of caramelized aroma that comes from aging for 30 months. And I don't know how long this one was. I should have looked it up. That aging in the barrel, it's 17% alcohol after the fortification, so it has a fiery warmth to it, but it really has a really beautiful like red fruit and like toffee and caramel flavor to it. It's not quite butterscotch, it's not buttery enough, but it's like really caramelized like toffee candied nuts.
And how much is like a Banyuls Grand Cru?
For price?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I also didn't buy this one, unfortunately, but they're not that expensive. And the more recent vintages, like we have a 2019 Banyul, not the Grand Cru, and we at Cork Buzz, and we sell it for $9 a glass. That's for 3 ounces. But it's a much younger, more ruby, kind of more like the ruby port, you know, like a younger, more fiery, more red fruited rendition of Banyul, because it is a newer vintage. It hasn't had as much time to sort of oxidize and dry out the fruit.
Yeah.
But this one would probably, I don't know how much, but these wines, like, you know, they're not inexpensive, but they're
not crazy.
really crazy expensive for what you get, which is cool. My partner likes he likes to like come home after work and drink like a little like Fortified or whiskey and stuff, so he buys a lot of stuff like this. So so thankfully I have them all here.
Are you gonna
I wish I had some Madeira, but we didn't.
Yeah, I know. I love that stuff. Do you are you able to email us the slides, or is that proprietary? Yes. Okay, cool.
I will. So tomorrow, along with the recording, I'll also just email you a PDF of these slides, and then even probably like a little follow-up, and then a few other information that, you know, we might have on the fortified style of wine.
Great. And do you guys do any just very quickly, any sort of educational type events with any like business wine clubs or schools, or is that something you know about?
Well, we do a lot of private events and classes at Cork Buzz. So in addition, we don't do as many. I mean, we used to do a lot of virtual classes, but obviously, you know, that the interest, we still do have the interest in virtual classes, but not nearly as much. So we do a lot of in-person classes, usually about once a week, that consumers can just purchase tickets to. And then we do private events too. So like if you mentioned, you know, right now we don't really have like a wine club or anything. Although
no, this would be I'm in business school, and they just started a wine club, and I'm part of the board. So we're looking for fun venues that we can start having events at, where you know, we there's some education, and you know, exactly like this, you know.
Yeah, we can definitely do something like that.
Okay, so maybe I'll email you after this, and we can keep the conversation going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No problem. Yeah, no, I can hook you up. We do have an event director too who can help with that, but she can also, you know, I'll email you after. So
cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's perfect. But we only have two kind of like two areas to really discuss. So we're moving from the sort of fortified styles of Palomino, of Sochal, Verdelho, the port grapes, the red grapes, into the grape Muscat. Muscat is one of the world's most ancient grapes, and it makes some of the world's most revered and sweet wines, especially coming from the style. I mean, and then also, of course, who can forget something like Moscato or Moscato d'Asti. Muscat is also used to make those styles of wine. And so you kind of understand that Muscat as a grape variety is intensely aromatic. It has a lot of like floral and really intense peachy flavors to the wine. It has a sort of almost like in a way, sort of a grapey flavor as well. So Muscat Vin du Natural, you see quite a bit in southern France. So the region of Roussillon, which we mentioned, well, you'll see Muscat of Rivesaltes. This was established in 1956. It can come from there's a lot of clones of Muscat, or a lot of different varieties of Muscat. So Muscat of Alexandria and Muscat au Petit Grand. Muscat au Petit Grand is considered to be the higher quality of the two. Some regions require only Muscat au Petit Grand. In the Languedoc, we have 4 appellations that are for the Muscat grape. They all come from Muscat au Petit Grand. The residual sugar of these is around 110 grams per liter, is the minimum required amount. So they do have a sweetness to them, but think of it, it's almost like Coca-Cola. Like Coca-Cola is 120 grams per liter of sugar, right? So almost drinking something like Coca-Cola, but they have a beautiful acidity to them. They have this gorgeous kind of like baked orange flavors, a lot of really floral, white flower, orange blossom aromas to the wines as well. You see 4 areas: Muscat de Frontignan, which is the largest. So you see the most wine coming from here: Miraval, Lunel, and Saint-Jean-de-Minervois. Saint-Jean-de-Minervois does have a higher requirement for the residual sugar. So 120 gram, 25 grams per liter. The most common style for Muscat in the Rhone, though, is Muscat Beaumes-de-Venise. So this will be the one you'll see most likely. 90% is produced by a local cooperative, so a number of growers who come together to make a single wine out of their grapes, called Vigneron de Beaumes-de-Venise. You might also see a style of wine that just says Beaumes-de-Venise. This is for the still dry red wines of the region, based on the Grenache grape we mentioned earlier. So if it doesn't say Muscat, it's going to be a dry red wine. If it says Muscat de Beaumes-de-Venise, it's going to be the sweet, white, fortified wine. The wines are not fortified to a very high level of alcohol. They're also kind of like that Pinot Sherry, sometimes around like 15 to 16%. Mistel wines. So this was that beautiful style of grape juice that is fortified. The wine never goes through fermentation, so it doesn't develop any of those flavors of yeast or fermentation either. It can be a much more transparent expression of the grape and the grape juice before that character is changed by the fortification. So because the wines aren't fortified, they don't have any alcohol. The level of alcohol that comes from the brandies tend to stand out quite a bit in Mistel. They tend to be a higher level of alcohol. In Champagne, you have a style called Ratafia. You can see it coming from Chardonnay or from Pinot Noir. In Cognac, you see Pinot de Charente, just coming out just outside of the Bordeaux region. Armagnac is known as Floc de Gascogne. And then in the Jura, you see the Macvin du Jura. The Macvin du Jura, you can make it in a white, a red, or rosé style out of any of the local grapes that you see within that region. So you don't see these mistels as often. We do have Ratafia by the glass at Cork Buzz, which is pretty cool. These other styles, we have several sherries, we have port, we have Banyuls.
What does the Ratafia taste like?
What's that?
What does the Ratafia taste like?
It has more of this like, kind of interesting, especially the Chardonnay has this almost like a straw-esque character to it. It tastes in a way more fruity because you don't have fermentation really will take away some of that. I mean, just think about the taste of wine versus fruit juice, right? Or grape juice. So aside from wine having typically regular wine not having any sugar, you also don't have as fruity of flavors as you do have in just grape juice. So the Ratafia and the Macvin, they do have a little bit more of this kind of fresher fruit juice flavor to them. But then the alcohol of the brandy, like if you think of having ever smelled alcohol that doesn't have any flavor to it, it has a little bit of that heat to it. There's a little bit more of that sort of warming sensation, and a little bit of that almost like if you've ever had something like cha-cha or grappa, like it's made from grape skin.
Ooh,
Also,
yeah,
it has a
yeah.
little bit of that to it as well. I don't really know how to describe the flavor.
Okay.
But yeah, it's really interesting style of wine. You don't see it that often. The other, so we talked primarily about all places within Europe. So that doesn't mean that the New World doesn't make styles of fortified wine. They certainly do. In the New World, when we had a lot of these um, people that were, traveling to places, to new lives in places within the New World, the Americas, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, so forth. A lot of them took grape varieties with them. And when they started making wine, they named the wine for the traditional styles or areas of their countries. Over time, this has created a lot of confusion, as in Europe, essentially we call the wine by the name of the place, right? Sherry is the name of the place. Port is the name of the place. Madeira is the name of the place. And each of those places has a set of rules regarding how the wine has to be made in that region, all of these fortified wines, in order to use that protected name, that protected place name on your label of wine. So in the New World, there were a lot of people that were calling their wine sherry or port or even unfortified styles of wine, right? Champagne, Burgundy, Bordeaux, Hardy Burgundy, right? Carlo Rossi. And essentially over time, these names have been phased out due to trade with the EU. In the EU, you have to sign a contract as a member company, or a member company, as a member country, to not use another country's protected designated place name on your bottle of wine. New World countries like Australia, for example, don't have to sign these same contracts, but the EU might refuse trade with those styles of wine. They probably want to import something coming from Australia called either like something like Tokai or Sauterne or sherry or port, which they used to make. So a lot of these New World countries have started to change the name of how they make these traditional fortified or kind of method or process driven wines, right? Or even from the grape that they make them from. You can't call it Burgundy anymore. So we see the most common area is in Northeast Victoria, right on the border of New South Wales. All Rutherglen Stickies are a blend of vintages. They come from brown Muscat. It can be either Muscat de Frontignan or Rouge à Petit Grand. There was a network established in 1995 that's sort of a producer association, a self-regulated 4-tier classification that's based on the taste profile. I think you're more likely to be able to taste more of these wines if you're in Australia or in this region. I don't see a lot of them coming into the US, but you might see Rutherglen Muscat at the basic level. And now think about how we talked about the Muscat, 110 grams per liter, right? In Beaumes-de-Venise and Languedoc. Rutherglen Muscat, 180 to 240 grams per liter of sugar in the wine. So these are much more lusciously sweet styles of wine, where the Muscat coming from France are a little bit more balanced with the acidity. These wines still have acidity to them, but they're going to be much thicker and much more sweet on the palate. You'll also see classic, grand, and rare, going up to the oldest, rarest, sweetest, most concentrated. I've never had a rare Rutherglen Muscat before. I think it would be really fascinating to try, but just imagine having something 270, 400 grams per liter. These are really, really intensely sweet, almost like deeply colored, like beautiful, almost orangish styles of wine in the glass. You can get so much sunshine on the skins of the grape. Now, because we've started to replace some of the traditional names, we in Australia, we no longer use the term Tokai, we use Topek. Topek is a Tokai style wine made from botrytis or dried grapes, from the Muscadel grape, and Apera is essentially the term that they use for sherry style wine, also made in the Solera system. We didn't get through so much. Oops. through much to the Solaris system when we were talking about sherry, but maybe that's something we can focus on tomorrow so I don't end up keeping you all night. Maybe I can send out a little follow-up with that. So
Yeah, no, thank you. That was great. I think I've studied a bit of Fortified for my level 2 WSET,
mhm,
and I think it was probably the hardest part to memorize because it was
yeah.
a lot. And I think I'm starting level 3 in a week, so I wanted a bit of a refresher. So this was really helpful.
Are you in New York?
Yeah, I'm taking the class at the International Wine Center, so it's going to be for a few months.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, I mean, I hope that you can come by Cork Buzz. You have my email, so definitely reach out. We'll be in touch about. I'll introduce you to our event director, and she can tell you, what we can do. But we can also do things like, large party reservations for blind tasting and things like that, which can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds fun. We just created this program, which is kind of cool. So they're kind of like, I'm the only one that has a real wine background. So
Mhm.
I'm older though, because it's the EMBA program too. And so they're kind of giving me the reins a little bit. But, I'm still, I guess the right word to use is negotiating the budget with them.
Mhm.
So, but I think we could do a lot of fun stuff because I think a lot of people are really interested in wine still, even though I've been reading in the news that a lot of wine sales are down in the younger generations.
Yeah, it's the pendulum swings,
Yeah, I agree.
right? I mean, I was honestly just thinking this is like kind of funny, but I was honestly just thinking this about like wine, but also about Doc Martens. I was like,
Mm.
gosh, there's a company. This is a great metaphor for wine and wine companies because like you look at like how like Doc Martens, I would like they never give up. Even
They
like
don't. They're
their sales
resilient.
must not be that consistent, but like here we are again. And like I got rid of like 20 pairs of Doc Martens like 10 years ago, and now here we are again. Everybody buying Doc Martens again.
I had like 2 pairs in the 90s. But yeah, I definitely think it's a cyclical thing. But
Yeah.
I will say this, like, even though maybe sales are down a bit, every time I go to an event or take a class, it is to the walls packed. So I don't really know how they're getting these numbers, like
I
who's
don't
crunching these
I don't
numbers.
know if they're looking at overall price or sales of SKUs too. Because the other thing that's been happening a lot in the past, decade or even longer, that they always say, well, people are drinking less, but they're spending more money on what they're drinking. So they're buying, one bottle instead of two, or drinking one bottle a week instead of two bottles a week, but that bottle that they do drink is of higher value typically. Um, so I don't know how,
Maybe
looking at overall sale price wise, or if they're looking at actual
that's
sales of
true.
SKUs.
Yeah, I feel like it just seems inaccurate to me, but I don't know. What do I know? All right, cool. Thank you. This was really great, and I'm excited to take a look at the slides so I can review them with my add it to my like study materials for the level 3.
Well, yep, we've got all kinds of study materials. So, all right, we'll talk soon. Thanks for
Thank
joining tonight.
you. Okay, have a great night.
You too. Bye bye.